It's time to make our bottom shelf. We've got our table dry assembled here, and we actually have to measure for what our bottom shelf is going to be. We can go by the plans, but you got to remember we've got a lot of work into this table, and it's probably not exactly the same size as the plans call for. So we're going to start taking measurements directly from our table to determine how large the bottom shelf needs to be. So the first thing I want to do is kind of lightly clamp this together so that all these joints are pulled tight, so that when I measure for my bottom shelf, I get an accurate number. So I've got everything dry fit here. Okay, I'm going to run 2 clamps from end to end, and I'm not going crazy with tightening these down, just a little bit. If I over tighten it, I'm going to bend these long rails and I'm going to get an inaccurate number. So everything's kind of held. My bottom shelf is going to be the distance, or the width of my bottom shelf is the distance from the inside of one long rail to the inside of the other long rail. And the length of my bottom shelf is going to be the distance from inside of the bottom shelf groove here on the one side to the inside of the bottom shelf groove on the other side. So with this clamped, I'm going to take my tape measure and I'm going to take a couple measurements, okay, close to the end here. So this tells me I'm 15 inches right there for width on this side. Hopefully this is the same over here, and it is. So the width of my table, bottom, is going to be 15. So I'm going to start writing my numbers down. I know it's going to have to be 3/4, okay, because that's the thickness of my groove. I just measured it. It's going to be 15 wide. To measure the length, I'm going to measure from rail to rail and then add 3/16 and 3/16 for the depth of my groove. So 3/16 plus 3/16 is 3/8. So I'm going to measure, and I have 19 5/8 plus 3/8 gives me 20 inches over here. I'm going to measure over here as well, and I've got the same number. So I know that my bottom shelf needs to actually be 20 inches long. Now I know the plans call for 20 1/8. Okay, this is why we measure, okay, so we can make sure that we get an accurate dimension for our bottom shelf. So my next step is to go ahead and find a bunch of material that I can glue side by side to get that 15 wide by 20 inch long dimension. So I'm going to go through the short rack, or I'm going to go in the back here, and I'm going to find material. I'm going to rough cut a few pieces down so that they're 21 inches long, so that I have extra material, so that after they're glued, I can go and cut them down to that exact 20-inch length that I'm looking for. So we'll be back here in a second with my material, and we'll talk about prep for gluing. Here are my 3 boards that I found. I was able to do this in 3 different boards to get to that little over 15-inch width that I want to start with. So what I'm going to do right now is lay these out, and I'm going to kind of look at the grain, and I'm going to look at defects that I might have on the board, and I'm going to determine the orientation that I want these to be in my glue up, so that I can make a bottom shelf that kind of looks appealing to me. So I like this orientation. So I know that I'm going to have 2 boards on the outside, 1 board in the middle. My next step here is I'm going to kind of mark these up so that I glue them back together in the orientation I want. So I'm going to put an X on the same surface, so I know that these are all going to be face up. And I'm going to put a little mark here, an arrow, okay, to the edges that are going to get glued. Okay, these will serve now as a reminder for me. I need to go to the joiner now and joint 1 edge on this board. I need to joint 1 edge on this board. And I'm going to joint 1 edge on this board. Now, because this board is in the middle, I need 2 edges that are nice and smooth, okay, for the glue to go ahead and adhere to. So if I joint this edge, I can go to the table saw and rip this edge parallel, okay, so that it is nice and straight and parallel with the existing edge, so that when I put all 3 of these together, I won't have any seams, and I'll have the perfect place for glue to go ahead and join these together. So I'm going to jump over to the joiner, joint one edge on each board, and then I'm going to head to the table saw and rip this board to a random width, just enough that I clean up this edge, and I'll meet you back here and we'll look at getting ready to glue. Alright, so I've got my marks. Okay, I'm going to joint the one edge on each of the outside boards and then one on the middle board here. Okay, on this middle board now I've jointed this edge. Now I want to go to the table saw and rip this edge so that it's parallel. Okay, I don't want to join it here because I want to make sure that these two edges stay parallel to each other, and the table saw is the best place to do that. So I've got my jointed edge, and now I'm at the table saw and I'm going to go ahead and clean up the opposite edge. Okay, it doesn't matter how much, we just want to make sure we trim enough off of the other side of this board so that it is nice and straight and cut completely. So I'm just going to kind of eyeball this, take maybe 1/8 of an inch or so off. Okay, double check my blade height, okay, make sure we're good, and I will go ahead and rip this real quick. All right, let's go take a look at the workbench. So back at the workbench, I've got all three of my pieces. X is up. I've got my two jointed edges on the outside board and my straight edges on my middle board. And you can see if I put these together, okay, I get fairly tight joints here. I've got a little gap here, but that'll get squeezed out with clamping pressure when we go to glue this. My next step, okay, is to apply glue and clamp these all together until that glue sets up to make one big panel that I'm going to make my bottom shelf out of. Okay, remember, and I haven't mentioned this yet, we have left these boards as thick as possible right now. I haven't jointed any faces and I haven't planed anything. I want to leave them as thick as I can so that I have as much material available as possible to go ahead and make sure I end up with that 3/4 inch thickness when we're done. If I plane them all to 3/4, I have to glue them and make sure that they stay perfectly flush on top, which is nearly impossible to do. So by leaving them thick, I allow for a little bit of difference in the height of these boards, and I can plane that out later. So we'll head over to the clamping table and we'll get some glue and clamp these up. Time to apply glue. We're over at our glue tables. I've got all my boards. I've got a bottle of glue. I've also got a wet paper towel to help a little bit with squeeze out that you're going to see in a minute. And I'm going to need 3 clamps. I have placed 2 of the clamps underneath my boards, and I've got a 3rd clamp off to the side here that I'm going to run across the top down the middle. I've laid it out so that all of my straight, jointed, and ripped edges are facing each other. And now I'm going to go ahead and apply some glue. When we're done here, we want to focus on trying to make sure that this panel is as flat as we can. So we're going to try and reference the panel against the bars of the clamp to help us keep them as flat as possible. So glue, we don't need a ton. Okay, I would say a thin bead in between each edge. Okay, so I've got a thin bead here. What I'm going to do is lay this down, bring my next piece in, and kind of give it a little slide back and forth to smear that glue around. Okay, and if I find spots where I feel like I need a little bit more, I might come add a couple drops here and there. But just shimmy these back and forth. Okay, put glue on here. We don't need glue on every single board. Okay, just a little bead of glue in between each joint. So slide that back and forth. Okay, that looks good. So pull everything tight. I'm going to start with my middle clamp. Okay, I'm going to place this over top. Okay, and I'm going to snug this up. I'm not looking to crank down on this quite yet. Okay, I just want to snug it, so I can still kind of adjust the position of these boards at the ends. I do want to try and make sure that they're in the same plane, so I'm pushing and pulling boards up and down to try and get them level with one another. And then I will apply clamping pressure. Okay, we'll do the same thing over here. I got quite a big gap here, so I'm going to try and muscle this around. Okay, and if it goes, great. If I have to loosen stuff up, so be it. So we'll tighten that up. Okay, and now we'll go back and we'll start applying pressure to each clamp, seating those joints firmly. Okay. Again, we don't need a ton of pressure, but we want to have enough pressure where we see a little bit of glue get squeezed out from the joint. And what we can do now is with that wet rag, okay, we can try and smear or wipe some of this excess glue off. Okay, we want to try and get rid of this now so that we don't have really hard glue to deal with later. Okay. We'll flip this over and check the same thing on the underside. All right, we'll leave this sit for a couple hours and then we'll come back and we'll talk about how to go ahead and get this down to its finished size. Our bottom shelf is dried. All right, pulled it out of the clamps. What we have to do now is go ahead and take the bottom shelf and get it cut down to the numbers that we measured originally. So what I'm going to do is take one of my ends, I'm going to unclamp everything and take one of my end panels or end assemblies here with me, and I'm going to plane this board until it fits inside the groove in our short rail, and then I'm going to joint one edge and I'm going to rip it to the number that we measured earlier, and then we're going to meet up at the panel saw and we'll talk about how we're going to cut such a wide board down to a finished length. So let me pull this all apart and we'll head over to the surface. stripped it to width. You saw it fit within the dado or the groove, and it fit in between the legs, which is what we're looking for. Our last step is to go ahead and cut this down to finished length. We're going to do it the same way we would cut any board. We're going to go ahead and trim one end nice and square, just taking a little bit off. You can see that this end is not exactly flush, and it's the exact same situation on the other side. So I want to trim one end up, and we're going to use the panel saw to do this. All right. The way the panel saw works is we've got a fence down here that the board will rest on, and then there's a circular saw inside of this housing that moves up and down on these tracks. And we're going to go ahead and put the board and align it with the saw, okay, by looking down over the top here. I'm just eyeballing this just like I would do on the chop saw. I'm only taking about a blade width off. Okay. When I have it aligned, I'm going to hold the board with my left hand, operate the saw with my right hand, bring the saw down until I cut all the way through, come up and shut the thing off. It is a little bit loud. So now I've cleaned this edge up. It's nice and smooth. Okay, so now I'm going to measure and mark my board to the finished length that we measured on our table. And I believe this was something like 20 inches. So I'm going to measure 20 inches from the edge I just cut. And I'm going to put a little tick mark on the top edge of the board because that's where I'm going to be able to align my blade with. So my mark is going to go on the top edge. Okay, I'm going to slide my board in, and I'm going to look down on top of my blade to make sure that I'm aligning appropriately with my mark. Okay, remember we want the mark or the blade to be on the scrap side of our line. So we'll line this up here. Okay, hold everything in place. Okay, now both ends are trimmed, both edges are parallel, and we should be exactly the right size to fit in our table. So let's head over to the workbench and double check and see if this indeed fits within our assembly. Back at the workbench here, we've got our bottom shelf all cut to size. We're going to go ahead and try and fit the whole works together and see that the table fits and all the joinery closes. So what I've done is I've taken one end and I've put all the rails in. Okay, I'm going to take my bottom shelf and put it in the groove in the lower short rail here. And then I'm going to simply cap this off with the other end assembly. Okay, this is the easier way to do it. Let gravity kind of help you set this up. So we're going to check and make sure that all of our joints still seat when we put our bottom shelf in. Okay, it looks good. Go. Good, good, good. All right, we're going to stand this up and see how we've done. There we go. A table. Okay, our next step is going to be taking one last look at everything, cleaning up all these burn marks and sand marks and any extra glue, because next step is to glue this whole assembly together and get ready for our top.